Welcome back, everyone, and welcome, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much, Sally. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to talk about my favorite topic.
So you are a UX designer, which I had to look up. It means user experience. So let's start with kind of what is a UX designer? Like, what is your job?
Mhm.
Like, what's the necessary skill set? What kinds of things does it combine? Let's dive right in.
Yeah, I'd love to. So UX does, in fact, stand for user experience. You found that. Glad to hear that it's being easily defined on the internet. But unfortunately, user experience doesn't really tell us what I do on a day-to-day basis. The term user experience was coined by a man named Don Norman from Apple, I believe in the 80s. Now he's a cognitive psychologist and he's written a bunch of books. But user experience effectively means everything that happens to you from the moment that you discover a technical product, so an app or a website, effectively, from discovering it all the way to the final time that you use it. So everything from how easy it is to find what you want to how you feel using it, to everything within a term that we call your context of use. So how much time you have to dedicate to something, how stressed you are about whatever you're using our app for. Um, and currently, I'm doing that for College Coach. We're starting to assess the current state of our apps and try to look to the future in order to give people more optimal experiences.
Okay, so what kind of an education did you need for it? Because it's not quite just
Yeah.
computer science, right?
No, it is very much not computer science.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do work with people who studied computer science on a daily basis. So I actually started studying computer science. I took a very non-traditional track into my career, and I think that's pretty standard with people in UX.
Mm-hmm.
But I started college at Villanova when I was 18. I was studying computer science for 2 years. Prior to that, in high school, I had a hobby of designing and building tiny apps. That was really at the beginning of the App Store boom, and I found it incredibly cool. I started jailbreaking my iPod Touch, and when I was finished with that project, I started learning to build apps, and I assumed that computer science would be my natural track. However, I found that in my intro courses, learning about Java and functions was not really the same like eclectic experience that I was used to in building functional apps. And I had a tiny work study at the time, working on a small app there. So after my sophomore year, I decided to take 2 gap years and actually attempt to work in the industry designing and developing apps. And I had a few tiny clients, a few small contracts to keep me going during that time and assessing what I really wanted to do. And during that time, I learned so much from making really terrible apps that didn't work well, that it is not just about building something that is incredibly technically sound. It's about understanding who is actually using this and what they care about.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to learn about who people are and what they care about optimally, I turned to psychology. And fortunately, I live very close to Lafayette College. So I transferred there, and they had an incredible psychology program. In my first year, I took a course called Human Factors and Engineering Psychology, which was all about UX. But actually, it goes sort of beyond UX. UX was derived from a field within cognitive psychology called human factors. So about like uh, human factors came about by looking at the arrangement of buttons on planes during World War II. So it has a very storied history in looking at the nature of physical products. But naturally, the mental models that go into using physical products are very similar to that of using software. So I fell in love with psychology, as you can tell, and I finished my undergraduate degree there. I graduated in 2021, and after graduating, I took a few months to build out my portfolio because the UX hiring process, since there is such a broad field of entry, is really heavily focused on how you can demonstrate that you can design an app well and execute the processes from discovery to handoff and everything that comes in between. So it's important to have either a website or a slide deck about products that you've worked on and your methodology and ultimately outcomes. So I compiled that. It took me about 3 months to get it to my standards, and then began the interview process and joined Bright Horizons as my first real corporate UX role in March of 2022.
Mm-hmm. So were there any sort of, I mean, we have the sense of your education, kind of a combination of computer science, certainly computer classes, but also psychology classes. But what about, and then building apps, which is kind of something you did clearly on your own, but were there extracurricular activities? Like, how did you like get started on the app thing? Did you just figure it out on your own? Did you work with other students? Like, talk a little more about that.
So, admittedly, when I tell the story of this, it seems very like self-centric. Like I spent ton of time reading documentation about a language called Objective-C to learn how to code. And at that time, there wasn't a ton of resources available for self-study. But I was going to this local networking event called Lehigh Valley Tech. I don't know if it's still functioning today, but it was just a group of professionals who were networking who took me under their wing and shared with me everything that they knew and gave me little projects to work on and critiqued my apps. And one thing that I found that was really helpful was joining something called a hackathon. A hackathon was really useful for me because you're basically building something from scratch, and you're working with a small team, and those teams are usually more technically focused, and they're often looking for designers because a well-designed app provides a lot of polish that can help you win something like that. And I've always found that developers at hackathons are always welcoming designers. Also, there's just a ton of online resources and online communities for UX. One that I've thought of a lot is a Discord server called Design Buddies that one of my colleagues had recently told me about, um, which is all about people who are learning UX for the first time, who are in their first jobs perhaps, or in college, who are looking for mentorship from a greater community. And like there's a lot of camaraderie in that. There are a lot of people who grew their careers from organizations like that who often like to contribute back into the community. So I can highly recommend those. There's also a lot of open coursework that I think is really relevant. Google just launched their own UX certification based on some of their practices. I believe that's on Coursera. A course I took that I found really valuable was one called Shift Nudge that focused more about like the visual design polish of an app. And that came with its own community. So there's really a lot of like extracurricular learning that can be done because the field is so grassroots.
Mm. Would you say that that is part of how you were also able to kind of get your job, or was it more about building your resume, or do things like that help people make connections? I mean, I don't know that there's a ton of Bright Horizons college coach people at hackathons, so it might not have helped you get our job, but
No, yeah. No, I see where you're coming from. Yeah, so while I did not network my way into Bright Horizons, I applied randomly on Indeed one day and
Mm,
got a call about an interview. What I found particularly helpful about courses like that and hackathons in general is that it gave me a list of projects where I could do real UX work, see the fruits of my labor, and refine my skill sets each time.
mhm.
And that's really the core of UX interviews in general, which is tell us about something you've worked on in the past. What did you learn from it? How did your perspective change? What methods did you apply? And what were the ultimate outcomes? And trying to answer those interview questions without having spent a decade in the industry is really hard. So you have to sort of create your own little resume. But fortunately, it's been my experience that employers recognize that young people haven't had that career experience, and thus, like, those tiny projects are the thing that gets you into the industry because it establishes that you're thinking about problems in the same way that people in the field are, or at least that you're open to exploring things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I came into interviews more prepared for having done those, and it made my actual hiring process much more interesting. And for what it's interesting to share. Bright Horizons had a really interesting interview process because my final stage was about redesigning a part of College Coach. So my now product manager, Cindy, had sent me a video of this scenario where she had walked through scheduling an appointment with one of our experts. And she asked me to basically explain how I would tackle assessing the usability of that experience and what changes I would make. So I spent like 48 hours. I took time off from my previous role, and I stared at my whiteboard for a long time, diagramming apps and explaining how I would run testing. And ultimately, I came into that interview with just so many unnecessary screens of how I thought that College Coach could work differently. It's so funny because now that I understand how College Coach works, so much of it made sense that I didn't think made sense at the time. But yeah, you're effectively, in order to get into this field, demonstrating your value by doing this role. Um,
So one last question, because we just have a
mhm.
couple minutes left. It seems to me that not just sort of computer science and psychology courses would be useful, but maybe also someone who has an eye for design in general, like someone who wants to combine art with those other fields. Like, would you say that's accurate?
Oh, absolutely. So I took a very technical approach to UX because I was a bit of a nerd growing up. But many of my colleagues studied or came to the field from some sort of art background. Plenty have been in marketing firms or studied marketing. There are many entry points into this field, and by no means is mine the only one or even the standard. I think because the field is so broad with what we do each day. No week for me is really the same, and that really just depends on the stage of our product's life cycle. Um, Skill sets have to come from like a lot of different places, and I think it's really important to articulate that uh, those those fields are just as valuable uh, to contribute to UX.
Mm-hmm. All right. Listen, thank you so much. This has been all kinds of new information for me, which is pretty rare on this show. Like, I tend to know what my guests are talking about. So this was really helpful. Thank you so much, Nick.
Oh, it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we're going to take a short break. And when we return, Quinn Kelly, current student at Tisch School at NYU, one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent musical theater program in the country. I know lots of people would argue, but anyway, it's definitely one of the best. She is going to be here to talk with us as soon as I get back.